just when you thought you had seen all the different types of budgets, what you have been looking at is what we refer to as a static budget. So a static budget is a budget that's prepared for a certain planned level of activity. So the budgets that we just finished, like we would pick a certain amount of units. So for example, 100,000 units of product, say that's what we were going to sell, that's what we need to produce. Well, all of our expenses are based on that 100,000 units of product. So they're what's called its static budget. So it's good for planning, it's what we're learning about, but we need a little bit more flexibility when we're comparing our budgeted cost to our actual cost. So if we have budgeted for 100,000 units, but we only sold and produced 750,000 units, just think about it. Would it be hard to compare the expenses, you think? As you can imagine, 750,000 units being less than 100,000 units, the expenses are going to be less just because you're producing less. So you won't be able to really tell if you did a good job of managing costs or are costs down just because you produce less. So you need to be able to compare things on the same level. So because I mentioned we need some flexibility, what we need is a flexible budget. So what flexible budgets do is they take into account like the changes in revenue and costs as they incur as a consequence of the actual activity. So it provides an estimate of what revenues and costs should be for any level of activity within a specified range. So you're easily able to compare your performance evaluations. When you're looking at your budgeted figures and your actual figures, you need to have the flexibility to adjust your budget so you can have a better comparison to what your actual and your budgeted figures were. So in this example, we have 10,000 machine hours. That's our static budget right here. So based on 10,000 machine hours, our variable costs are these costs. And our fixed costs, well, they're probably going to stay the same because they're fixed no matter what level of activity we're at, right? So if we want to compare our budget to our actual results, we only had 8,000 machine hours. So as you can imagine, our variable costs are less. They've gone down, but our fixed costs are relatively the same. So overall, our total overhead costs have decreased. So when we want to compare these figures and look at the variances, so the first variances are machine hours. We've actually had less machine hours than we thought. We have 2,000 less machine hours than we budgeted for. We would consider this an unfavorable variance because we were unable to achieve the budgeted level of activity. So that is unfavorable. We are not happy with that. So next, when we compare the costs, we consider those favorable because the actual costs are less than our budgeted costs. So we saved money. But why did we save money? So since cost variance are favorable, do we know if we've done a good job controlling costs? Or are costs just down because machine hours are down? Production is down. So we need to be able to look at these and ask the question, have we done a good job controlling costs? This doesn't tell us whether we have or not. It can't be answered with a static budget performance report. So we need to ask the question, how much of the favorable cost variance is due to the lower activity and how much is due to good cost control? So the answer can be found in a flexible budget. So to prepare a flexible budget, we need to consider what we know about variable costs and fixed costs. So we know that total variable costs change in direct proportion to changes in activity, and we know that total fixed costs remain unchanged within the relevant range. So we have to go back to the basics and think of that. So it's important when we're preparing a flexible budget that we know our variable costs per unit, or in this case, per hour. So our variable costs are expressed as a constant amount per hour. So 40,000 was our indirect labor costs. We know we had 10,000 hours, so we divide the total by the hours and we get $4 an hour, and so on. So we broke down our variable costs on a per unit or per hour basis. The fixed costs are expressed as a total amount because that's the fixed cost, and it doesn't matter how many units or hours we have in production. That's the cost, and we can't really do anything about it. Well, we can, but not right now. That's a different story. So if we know that indirect labor is $4 an hour, and we have 8,000 hours, we can calculate that if we do a flexible budget, that our indirect labor should cost us $32,000, and so on. So we have $3 per hour of indirect materials times 8, 24,000. Our power, 0.5 times 8, 4,000. So our total variable cost at 8,000 hours is 60,000. So this is our flexible budget. So we were able to do that because this was our static budget at 10,000 hours. But if we break it all down on a per unit or per hour basis, we have the formula and the capability and the knowledge and the smarts. I have faith in you, because students have had trouble with this theory in the past. But just know that, okay, we started with this, so we can easily break it down on a per unit basis. So once we have our variable costs on a per unit basis, it's really easy to calculate them at any level. So now at 8,000 hours, this is our budget based on the static budget on a per hour basis. And we can go forward. We could do that at 12,000 hours. Our total fixed costs don't change in the relevant range. So what should the total overhead cost for the flexible budget at 12,000 hours be? So we would do the same thing. Our fixed costs would be the same. And then we'd have $7.50 an hour times 12,000 hours. The cost of the product per hour, the total was $7.50 multiplied by 12,000 hours times plus our fixed cost of 14, we get 104,000 right there. So now that we've calculated a flexible budget at various levels, 8, 10, and 12, now we're better able to compare to our actual results. So our actual results were 8, so we would compare it to our flexible budget of 8. It's the same level of activity, so we can better measure if the costs are changed, like what are the actual variances at the same level of activity. So this is interesting. So our flexible budget of indirect labor was 32. Our actual was 34. So our variance was actually unfavorable. We are over what our budgeted numbers show we should be. So that's a different story than if we're comparing our actual to our 10,000 hours flexible budget, right? We thought everything was great. We saved so much money, but in actuality, we did not. We spent more money on indirect labor. What else? Our indirect material was 24. Was the budget? We actually spent 25.5. That's unfavorable as well. We spent more money on indirect material than we should have. Well, that's different than the static comparison, right? Our power was 4,000 on the budget. Actual was 38. That one's good. We saved $200. But overall, our variance was 3,300 unfavorable. So that's a better picture of how we're doing controlling costs. We are not doing very good controlling costs, but when we didn't know that, when we measured the static budget of 10 against the actual of 8, we thought we were doing great. But the lower costs were all could be written off to lower hours. So that's why we need to make sure we're doing our flexible budget at the same level so we have a lot better picture. And the main way to do that is to make sure that the numbers that you're given in the static budget, once you break them down on a per unit or per hour formula, whatever they are in, you can easily transfer them to be at whatever level you need them to be to make a good comparison. So that's the good thing about a flexible budget. It really shows you where your problems are. So in the fixed cost here, it's unfavorable as well. Our insurance was up more than we thought. But the variable cost is what really should be concerning. Our labor and direct materials are higher than we thought. So we need to drill down. That shows us, that shines a light on an area where there's a problem. So we need to, as managers, find out, why is our labor costing us more? Why is our indirect materials costing us more? So that gives us somewhere to start. So remember the question from earlier. How much is the $11,650 favorable variances due to lower activity? And how much is due to cost control? So when we go back to the variance, we actually had an $11,650 favorable variance. When we did it, actually, we had a $3,350 unfavorable variance when we used the flexible budget. So if we look at the flexible budget performance report and the overhead variance analysis, our static overhead budget at 10,000 hours and our actual overhead budget at 8,000 hours is 77,350. So now if we put our flexible budget for 8,000 hours here, the difference between the original static budget and the actual overhead is $11,650 favorable. So that means that the difference from our static overhead budget to our flexible overhead budget, that's activity. So the difference between these two budgets is a $15,000 favorable variance. That amount is due to lower activity. But if we compare our flexible overhead budget at 8 and our actual overhead budget at 8, we're comparing on the same playing field. We're looking at cost control. This is a $3,350 unfavorable variance due to poor cost control. So there's where we find the problem when we analyze them. We need to be analyzing them at the same levels so we know exactly where our problems are. So that's what's so important about flexible budgeting. We weren't really going to go over too much over budgeting for not-for-profits. You can read about it a little bit. There's often no relationship between revenues expected and received and expenditures, that kind of thing. And right now, not-for-profits, you hear they're all suffering for sure. And we're going to do a little bit more about not-for-profits in FA3, and we'll have a guest speaker.